Detective Rourke had been on the force for 22 years, and in all that time, he'd never once doubted that his badge was more than just a piece of metal. It was armor. Not the kind that stopped bullets, though it did that too, but the kind that kept consequences at arm's length. He walked into rooms like he owned them. Cops half his age stood a little straighter when he passed. Even captains gave him a wide berth, not out of fear exactly, but respect. Earned, he believed, through years of cleaning up the city's messes while others looked away. He wasn't flashy. Didn't wear sunglasses indoors or strut around like some TV cop, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he carried himself, like the rules bent just slightly in his favor because he'd spent decades enforcing them, and maybe they did. Internal Affairs had looked into him twice, once over a use of force complaint, another time about missing evidence, but both times, the cases quietly vanished. No reprimands, no headlines, just whispers in the break room that faded by lunchtime. To him, that wasn't corruption. That was loyalty. That was the system working the way it should, protecting the ones who protected everyone else. So, when the call came in on a rainy Tuesday evening about a domestic disturbance out in the Oak Ridge neighborhood, quiet area of tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns, he didn't think much of it. Probably another couple screaming over bills or a broken dishwasher. He'd seen it all. The shattered wine glasses, the trembling hands, the rehearsed apologies. Most of the time, by the time he arrived, one party had already backed down, embarrassed or exhausted, and he'd just file a report, give a stern warning, and head back to his cruiser. This call felt the same at first glance. A woman had dialed 911, voice shaking, saying a man had shoved her against the wall and threatened to make her disappear if she ever called the police again. Standard script. Rourke sighed as he pulled up, rain tapping softly on his windshield. He grabbed his notepad, adjusted his belt, and stepped out into the damp evening. The house was modest. White siding, a potted fern by the door, a Prius in the driveway. Everything about it screamed normal. That's what made these calls tricky. No blood, no broken furniture, just fear hanging in the air like smoke after a fire's been put out. She answered the door before he even knocked. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, eyes red but dry now. She wore sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, barefoot on the hardwood floor. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood there, arms crossed, like she'd already decided this was a waste of time, but was going through the motions anyway. He asked the usual questions. What happened? Who was the man? Did he hit you? She answered calmly, clearly, naming a guy he'd seen before. Low-level trouble, a few noise complaints, once caught with a bag of pills but never charged. The kind of guy Rourke usually let slide if he seemed respectful. She showed him her forearm, bruises blooming in soft purples and yellows. Said he'd grabbed her hard enough to leave marks, then shoved her into the hallway mirror. She pointed to a crack in the glass. That wasn't there this morning, she said flatly. Rourke nodded, scribbling notes. But inside he was already categorizing her. Too composed. Too articulate. That usually meant she'd been through this before, or she was playing a role. He'd seen women exaggerate injuries to get leverage in custody battles, or to punish a boyfriend for cheating. Not that he blamed them exactly. But his job wasn't to play therapist. It was to keep the peace, and sometimes that meant not stirring up more trouble than necessary. He called the man anyway. Gave him a chance to tell his side. Predictably, the guy said it was all a misunderstanding. Said she'd started yelling, threw a phone at him, and he just guided her away to calm things down. No violence. No threats. Just stress. Rourke knew the drill. 2 stories, 0 witnesses, and a mountain of paperwork either way. Back at the station, he typed up his report. Used words like alleged and disputed and no visible signs of injury beyond minor bruising. He didn't mention the cracked mirror. Didn't note that the man had a prior for harassment, that Rourke himself had closed without follow-up. He wrote just enough to say he'd responded, just enough to cover his bases, but not enough to trigger a deeper investigation. Because in his mind, that's what good policing looked like. Discretion, judgment. Not every argument needed a criminal case. Not every bruise meant abuse. And dragging a guy downtown over a domestic squabble? That could ruin lives, jobs, families. He told himself he was being fair, balanced, but really he was being lazy. And maybe a little arrogant, because deep down, he believed he could tell who was telling the truth just by looking at them. And this woman, She didn't fit the victim mold he carried in his head. She wasn't sobbing. She didn't flinch when he moved. She asked questions about her rights, about whether he'd file a restraining order recommendation. That bothered him more than he'd admit. Victims were supposed to be grateful, not demanding. So he filed the report, closed the case in the system, and moved on. By morning, he'd forgotten her name, forgotten the crack in the mirror, forgotten the way she'd stood in her doorway like she already knew the system wouldn't help her. What he didn't know was that she hadn't called the police because she expected justice. She'd called because she needed a record, a timestamp, proof that she'd tried. And she wasn't done. While Rourke grabbed coffee with his partner and joked about another Tuesday in paradise, she was already scanning her medical records, emailing a neighbor about their security camera, and drafting a formal complaint to the city's oversight board. She'd worked in legal aid years ago. She knew how paper trails worked, knew that one report meant nothing but a pattern that could crack open a whole department. But Rourke didn't see any of that coming. Why would he? He'd never been the one on the other side of the report. Never been the person whose truth got softened into alleged or disputed. His badge had always been his shield, his voice always the one that mattered most in the room. He went home that night, kissed his dog, poured a glass of whiskey, and never once wondered if he'd made a mistake, because in his world, mistakes were for rookies. For people who hadn't earned the right to decide what mattered and what didn't. He didn't know it yet. But that rainy Tuesday evening was the first thread pulled in a tapestry he'd spent his whole career weaving. And soon the whole thing would start to unravel, one quiet, determined woman at a time. She didn't cry that night. Not after the officer left, not after she locked the door and checked every window twice. She sat on the edge of her couch, wrapped in an old quilt, staring at the crack in the hallway mirror like it was a message written in code. It wasn't anger she felt. Not yet. It was something colder, sharper, clarity. She'd seen this before. Not in her own life, but in the files she used to sort back when she worked for a legal aid nonprofit. Page after page of women who'd done everything right, called the police, gone to the hospital, saved texts, and still got told it wasn't enough. Now she was one of them, but she wasn't helpless, and she wasn't going to disappear quietly. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, she made a list. Not a dramatic one, just practical steps written in neat handwriting on a yellow legal pad. Get medical records. Ask Ms. Chen about her camera. Save all messages. Find the old case file. She'd kept copies of everything from the moment things started going wrong. The texts, the voicemails, even the grocery receipt from the night he'd followed her home from the store. Back then she'd told herself she was just being careful. Now she knew she'd been preparing. Her neighbor, Ms. Chen, lived 2 doors down and had a small security camera above her garage that pointed toward the street, and luckily part of the sidewalk in front of her house. She'd seen the officer's cruiser pull up that night. When asked, she didn't hesitate. "Of course I'll check," she said, handing over a thumb drive the next afternoon. "That man scares me too." The footage was grainy but clear enough. It showed the man pacing outside her house earlier that evening, then shoving her against the wall just beyond her porch light. It also showed the officer arriving, speaking briefly to the man, who stayed calm, even smiled, while she stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. The officer never asked to see the bruise, never looked at the mirror, never even stepped inside. She saved the video in 3 places. Then she called the city's civilian oversight board, the kind of office most people didn't know existed until they needed it. The woman who answered sounded tired but kind. "We get a lot of complaints," she said gently. "But if you have evidence, we'll look at it." That was all she needed to hear. While she gathered facts, the officer went about his days like nothing had changed. He filed reports, attended briefings, joked with his squad over bad coffee. He heard a rumor that the woman had contacted oversight, but he just chuckled. "Good luck with that," he told his partner. "They'll take one look at my record and toss it." He wasn't worried. He'd survived worse, or so he thought. What he didn't realize was that this woman wasn't trying to win a shouting match. She was building a case, brick by quiet brick. She visited the clinic where she'd gone after the incident. The nurse remembered her. "You were so calm," she said, pulling up the file. "Most people are shaking. You just kept asking if they documented everything." The report noted contusions consistent with blunt force trauma and patient expressed fear of retaliation. She got a signed copy. Then she dug into the man's past. A quick search through public records showed he'd been named in 2 other police reports, both involving women who later dropped their complaints. One had even moved out of state. She tracked down an old news snippet about a bar downtown that had been cited for underage drinking. The owner? The same man. And guess who'd signed off on the final inspection report that cleared the place? The officer. It wasn't proof of a conspiracy. Not yet. But it was a pattern. And patterns mattered. She reached out to a lawyer she'd met years ago during her legal aid days, a woman who specialized in civil rights and police accountability. They met at a quiet cafe, far from her neighborhood. Over tea, she laid out everything: the video, the medical file, the texts, the connections. The lawyer didn't interrupt, just listened, eyes narrowing slightly with each new detail. "This isn't just about one incident," the lawyer finally said. "This is about how the system protects certain people and fails others. If we move forward, it won't be easy. They'll try to discredit you. They'll say you're lying, exaggerating, seeking attention. Are you ready for that?" She nodded. "I'm more afraid of staying silent." Meanwhile, the officer started hearing whispers. Not from his superiors, no, they still treated him like a veteran, but from the younger officers. Averted glances, hushed conversations that stopped when he walked by. Someone had seen the oversight complaint. Someone else heard she'd gone to the press. She hadn't, but rumors grow legs in precincts. He brushed it off. Called her that troublemaker in a briefing. Said she was trying to turn a lover's quarrel into a circus. He even leaned on a witness, a mutual friend of the man, who'd initially told police he'd heard shouting that night. Now, under pressure, the friend claimed he must have been mistaken, that maybe it was just the TV. But the woman expected that. She'd recorded their first conversation on her phone, legally with consent, and saved the audio. She added it to her folder. The turning point came when she found another woman. Through an online support group for survivors of coercive control, she connected with someone who'd dated the same man 5 years earlier. That woman had also called the police after he broke her phone and blocked her from leaving the house. The responding officer? Not the same one, but the report had been mysteriously closed within 48 hours, labeled unfounded. And guess who'd reviewed it before it was archived? The detective. They met in a public park, 2 strangers bound by the same silence. Over benches and weak coffee from a thermos, they compared notes. Same tactics, same charm turned to control, same feeling of being gaslit by the very people sworn to help. "I thought it was just me," the other woman said, voice trembling. "Like I was crazy for thinking it was serious." "You weren't," she replied. "And you're not alone anymore." Now she had more than evidence. She had corroboration. Back at the precinct, the officer felt the walls closing in. Not physically, but in the way his captain avoided eye contact during roll call, in the way his usual lunch table suddenly had no room. He doubled down, started telling anyone who'd listen that she was obsessed, that she'd been stalking the man, that her complaints were baseless. He even filed a memo suggesting she might be mentally unstable, a dangerous claim, but one he knew would stick in people's minds. What he didn't know was that every word he said, every attempt to smear her, was being logged. Her lawyer had warned her, when someone with power feels threatened, they don't back down. They attack. Let them. Every move they make leaves a trail. And trails lead somewhere. By the end of the month, she had a thick binder of documents, timestamps, witness statements, and digital records. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't begging. She was simply showing again and again that what happened to her wasn't an accident. It was part of a system that let certain men operate with impunity as long as they wore the right uniform or knew the right people. The officer still believed he was untouchable. After all, he'd never been punished before. Why start now? But this time, the woman he'd dismissed wasn't going away. She wasn't waiting for someone else to fix it. She was doing it herself. one careful, deliberate step at a time, and soon, she'd make sure the whole city was watching. He thought bringing her to court would end it, not because he believed in justice, though he'd tell himself that later, but because he believed in control. In his mind, the courtroom was just another room he owned. Judges nodded when he spoke. Prosecutors trusted his word over civilians. And people like her? They usually folded under the lights, the formality, the weight of it all. He'd seen it happen too many times to count. So when the district attorney agreed to press charges against her, for filing a false police report of all things, he felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't personal, he told himself. It was procedure, a message. If you accuse an officer without solid proof, there are consequences. That's how you keep order. That's how you protect the badge. He didn't consider that she might show up ready. The morning of the hearing, he put on his full uniform, polished boots, crisp shirt, badge gleaming like a medal. He wanted to look like what people expected, the hero, the protector, the man who kept the streets safe. He walked into the courthouse with his chin high, exchanging nods with bailiffs and clerks who'd known him for years. To them, he wasn't just a detective. He was institution. She arrived alone, no dramatic entrance, no crowd of supporters. Just a woman in a simple navy dress, hair pulled back, carrying a worn leather satchel. She looked calm. Too calm, he thought. That bothered him more than if she'd been shaking, because calm meant she wasn't afraid. And if she wasn't afraid, then his usual tactics wouldn't work. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with stiff chairs and a flickering fluorescent light in the corner. A handful of reporters sat in the back, local news mostly, drawn by whispers of a rare case where a civilian was being charged after accusing an officer. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with silver hair and tired eyes, scanned the room before calling the case. The prosecutor stood first. He laid out the argument cleanly. The officer responded to a domestic call, filed a standard report, and later discovered the woman had exaggerated her injuries and fabricated threats to frame an innocent man. This isn't just about one false statement, he said. It's about undermining public trust in law enforcement. The officer sat straighter. That was his line. That was the story he'd told his captain, his partner, himself. He glanced at her, expecting to see shame, regret, anything. Instead, she was taking notes. Then her lawyer stood. Not flashy, not loud, just steady. Your Honor, she began. My client isn't here to defend herself against a charge. She's here to expose a pattern. She asked for permission to introduce new evidence, evidence not in the original file. The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed it, curious. What happened next wasn't fireworks. It was quiet devastation. First, the lawyer played the neighbor's security footage. The courtroom fell silent as everyone watched the man shove the woman, then saw the officer arrive, speak briefly to the aggressor, and leave without entering the home or documenting the visible bruise. The officer shifted in his seat. He hadn't known that video existed. Then came the medical records, stamped, signed, dated the morning after the incident. Contusions consistent with forceful gripping and impact, the doctor had written. Next, screenshots of threatening text messages from the man, sent hours before the 911 call. Then the audio recording of the witness recanting, followed by the earlier call where he admitted hearing yelling, and seeing the man block the doorway. The prosecutor's face went pale. But the real blow came last. The lawyer handed the judge a USB drive. This contains internal police communications, body cam metadata logs, and archived case files that show a consistent pattern of this officer closing complaints involving the same individual, despite prior red flags. She didn't accuse him of taking bribes or being violent. She didn't need to. She just showed that he'd ignored evidence, skipped steps, and labeled serious claims as unfounded without proper review, over and over. The judge didn't say much, just took the drive, glanced at the officer, then at the woman, and announced a recess. I need time to review this, she said. Hearing postponed for 2 weeks. As people filed out, the officer stood frozen. No one looked at him. Not the bailiff, not the clerk, not even his own prosecutor, who hurried out without a word. For the first time in 20 years, he felt invisible, not because he was powerful, but because he was suddenly suspect. Outside, reporters swarmed the woman. Do you feel vindicated? One asked. She shook her head. I don't want vindication. I want accountability. Back at the precinct, the mood had shifted. His locker had been cleaned out. Not officially, but someone had removed his framed commendations. His usual coffee spot was full. When he tried to explain what happened in court, his partner just said, "Man, you should have let it go." He couldn't sleep that night. Kept replaying the video in his head, the way she stood there silent while he dismissed her. He told himself he'd done nothing illegal, but for the first time he wondered if legal and right were the same thing. Meanwhile, she went home, made tea, and called the other woman she'd met in the park. "They saw it," she said softly. "They actually saw it." News of the hearing spread fast. Local blogs picked it up. A city council member demanded an independent review. The police chief issued a vague statement about due process, but quietly ordered internal affairs to reopen 3 old cases tied to the same officer and the same bar owner. The officer tried to act normal. Showed up for shift, filled out paperwork, even cracked a joke at roll call, but the laughter didn't come. And when he passed the evidence room, he saw 2 investigators he didn't recognize going through archived files, his files. He started second-guessing everything. Had he really deleted that body cam clip? Or had it just glitched? Was it wrong to tell that witness to think carefully before giving a statement? He'd always believed he was using his judgment. Now he wondered if judgment had just been another word for bias. 2 days later, the police union released a statement defending him, calling the charges politically motivated. But even that felt hollow, because the public wasn't buying it. Comments poured in online. Not angry rants, but quiet stories. "This happened to my sister." My report was closed too. I stayed silent because I thought no one would believe me. Each one was a stone added to the pile. He thought the courtroom would be his stage. Instead, it became her platform. And now the whole city was listening. He still wore his badge. But it didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a target, and the worst part? He knew he'd done this to himself. Not with one big mistake, but with 1,000 small ones. Each time choosing convenience over truth, loyalty over justice, his own certainty over someone else's pain. The hearing was only postponed. But in his gut, he knew. When it resumed, the story wouldn't be about her lying, it would be about him failing. The days after the courtroom hearing felt like slow-motion collapse. It wasn't a single explosion, no handcuffs at dawn, no dramatic press conference, but a quiet unraveling thread by thread, until the whole thing started to come apart in his hands. At first, he told himself it was just bad timing. A few misunderstandings. Maybe he'd cut corners, sure, but who hadn't? Policing wasn't perfect. You made calls in the moment. You trusted your gut. But as more people came forward, quietly at first, then with growing confidence, he realized his gut had been wrong more often than he cared to admit. It started with an old case from 3 years back. A woman had reported that a regular at the downtown bar, the same one tied to the man in the current case, had followed her home, left notes on her windshield, and showed up at her workplace. She'd filed a report. He'd taken it, nodded sympathetically, and then quietly closed it as unfounded after the bar owner called him personally, saying it was all a miscommunication. Now, that woman saw the news about the hearing and reached out to the oversight board. She still had the notes, still remembered the fear. Then another voice surfaced. A young officer, barely 2 years on the job, admitted in a confidential interview that he'd once flagged suspicious behavior by the same bar owner. Late-night loitering, underage kids going in and out, but was told by a senior detective to let it go, unless you want to make enemies. He'd stayed silent out of loyalty. Now he couldn't. The department tried to contain it. Internal Affairs launched a routine review, but the media wasn't buying the spin. A local journalist, digging through public records, found that at least 4 complaints involving that bar or its owner had been closed by the same detective over 6 years, all without follow-up interviews, forensic checks, or victim support referrals, all marked, no further action needed. Worse, the body cam footage that had supposedly glitched during the night of the domestic call. A tech specialist from an independent watchdog group recovered it from a backup server. The missing minute showed the officer telling the man, "Just keep it quiet next time, all right?" Before walking away. No warning, no citation. Just a nod between men who understood the rules, even if those rules weren't written down. When that clip leaked online, the comments weren't just angry. They were disappointed. And disappointment, he learned, cuts deeper than outrage. His phone stopped ringing. Not from friends, from everyone. His usual gym buddy forgot to save his spot. His favorite diner waitress suddenly couldn't remember his order. Even his dog seemed quieter, watching him with eyes that used to light up when he walked through the door. He tried to explain himself to his captain, voice tight with frustration. "I was keeping the peace," he said. "You know how it is. You can't chase every shadow." But the captain just looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse, pity. "Peace isn't silence," he said quietly. "Peace is justice done right. And you stopped doing it right a long time ago." The union still offered legal support, but their tone had changed. Less "we've got your back," more "we'll." The courtroom wasn't packed on the final day, but it didn't need to be. The air felt heavier than before, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Reporters sat in the back, pens ready, but no one whispered. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about what came after. The judge entered, calm and steady, and called the matter to order. The criminal charges, the ones accusing the woman of filing a false report, were dropped. Not because of a dramatic confession or a last-minute witness, but because the district attorney's office admitted there wasn't enough evidence to prove intent to deceive. In fact, the evidence showed the opposite. She'd been truthful from the start. The officer sat in the front row, still in uniform, but without his badge pinned to his chest. He'd taken it off that morning, not because he was ordered to, but because it finally felt like a lie. But the story didn't end there. While the criminal case closed, the civil lawsuit moved forward. And this time, it wasn't just about bruises or broken glass, it was about trust, how it's given, how it's broken, and how hard it is to rebuild once it's gone. The woman didn't ask for revenge. She asked for change. Her lawyer laid out a clear request: policy reforms, independent oversight with real power, and mandatory training on bias and trauma-informed response for every officer in the precinct. The city fought it at first. Lawyers argued about liability, budgets, precedent, but public pressure kept growing. Petitions gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Community meetings filled City Hall. Former victims, some who'd stayed silent for years, spoke up, not to shame one man, but to say, "This can't keep happening." And then, quietly, the department began to listen. 6 months later, a settlement was reached. Not millions, but enough. $2.3 million to send a message that ignoring abuse has a cost. More importantly, the city agreed to sweeping reforms. All domestic violence calls would now require a second officer for review. Body cam footage would be uploaded automatically within an hour. Civilian oversight would have subpoena power and direct access to internal files. The bar tied to so many complaints lost its liquor license after a separate investigation uncovered underage sales and witness intimidation. The owner faced charges of his own. The officer never went to jail. The system, for all its flaws, protected him from criminal punishment. Technicalities, expired statutes, lack of direct evidence shielding him from prison. But he lost everything else. His pension was reduced. His commendations were rescinded. His name, once spoken with respect in precinct halls, was now used in training seminars as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you confuse authority with immunity. He moved out of the city, took a job at a warehouse loading trucks, working nights when no one asked questions. He kept to himself. Sometimes he'd see a news clip about the new police oversight council or a community safety forum, and he'd turn the channel. Not out of bitterness, but shame. He finally understood that the badge hadn't made him invincible. It had made him responsible. And he'd failed that responsibility, not in one moment, but in 1,000 small choices where he chose ease over truth. Meanwhile, the woman didn't disappear into quiet victory. She used part of the settlement to start something new. A small nonprofit called Clear Record. It wasn't flashy. No big offices or glossy brochures. Just a team of counselors, legal advocates, and former officers who believed in accountability. They helped survivors document their experiences properly. How to save texts, request body cam footage, file complaints that couldn't be ignored. They held workshops at libraries and community centers, teaching people that the system only works if you know how to use it. She didn't call it justice, she called it preparation. At one of those workshops, a young woman raised her hand, voice trembling. "What if they don't believe me?" she asked. The woman smiled gently. "They might not," she said. "But if you have proof, if you stay calm, if you keep showing up, they'll have to look. And sometimes just being seen is the first step to being heard." Her work didn't fix everything. Bad calls still happened. Officers still made mistakes. But now there were more eyes watching, more voices speaking up, and fewer people walking away thinking, "It's not worth it." The ripple spread further than anyone expected. 2 other cities adopted similar oversight models. A state legislator introduced a bill requiring all domestic violence reports to be reviewed by a supervisor within 24 hours. Even the police academy updated its curriculum, adding modules on implicit bias and victim-centered response, taught in part by former civilians who'd been failed by the system. Back at the precinct, new recruits were shown the recovered body cam footage, not as punishment but as a lesson. "This," the training sergeant would say, "is what happens when you stop seeing people and start seeing problems to be managed." As for the officer, he never reached out, never apologized. Maybe he couldn't. Or maybe he knew some things can't be fixed with words. But one rainy evening, months later, he drove past the community center where Clear Record held its meetings. He didn't stop, just slowed for a moment, watching through the window as a group of people, men and women, young and old, sat in a circle, talking, listening, taking notes. He drove on. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel angry. Just small, and maybe, just maybe, a little hopeful that someone else wouldn't have to go through what she did. Because the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the settlement. It was in the quiet courage of one woman who refused to be erased, and in all the others who, seeing her stand, found the strength to stand too. The badge didn't make anyone invincible, but the truth, that had power all its own.